reading something from Samantha Power's extraordinary book, A Problem from Hell, which addresses America's policy on genocide, or I should say America's non-policy on genocide, because we have never even ratified the UN treaty, UN position on genocide. In June 1942, the US and British officials and journalism were skeptical about reports that more than 1 million Jews throughout Europe were being killed by German forces. They claimed this was unsubstantiated information. As a Swiss editor responded, "We received no pictures of photographic exactitude, only silhouettes." I guess I will introduce myself as the frog that got out of the water, because for 10 years I have been immersed in this subject of armed conflict, and I could not even look at your images. I couldn't look at Schindler's List, and I couldn't look at The Godfather. I can't look at violence anymore. I did it because I believed in the project. In 2002, my colleague and I, Will Michaels, began a project that took us 10 years, in which we decided to look at armed conflict. When we began, like most people, when you say the words armed conflict, we thought about the two sides of it, the factual fighting and the grief that results. We made, one of the first decisions that we made was that every photograph in the exhibition would be powerful. And I'll read you a quote from 1855 regarding one of the first conflict photographers, Roger Fenton. And the London Illustrated News said that Fenton's photographs will be presented as records of the dreadful Crimean struggle, long after traces of war's iron hoofs have been effaced from time. In other words, we wanted photographs that, long after we forgot the issues that they documented, the photographs themselves had a power, a graphic power, a perfect merger of subject matter and craft that would continue to engage us. Wait a minute. The second decision that we made was that we would not pull our punches. That if this exhibition were to work as we wanted it to work, we had to show armed conflict at its most horrendous. And these are two different kinds of events in war, but it's very important to understand the difference. There are many types of killing in war. One of them is the actual conflict, the coming together of two sides in issues of whatever issues started this conflict. Now, it's important to also understand the other one. Basically, these are family members searching a battlefield for their loved ones, or for 50 years, we thought it was family members searching a battlefield for their loved ones. Only in the last 3 years has a Jewish scholar determined that, in fact, these are all Jewish men whom a retreating Nazi army took out from the city of Kerch and killed as they were retreating. And the reason the caption on the picture was changed was because the Russian and power needed Russians in central Russia, where the war was not especially affected by the war, to keep supplying them with goods for the war to continue. And they said, quote unquote, that the Russian peasant would fight for fellow Russians but not for Jews. So they changed the caption on the picture, and we didn't know any different for 50 years. These instances, the matter of execution is one of the most misunderstood ideas about war by the general public. I think I went into it, and many of the people I have spoken to went into it, thinking that matters of execution engage some kind of tribunals, some just, but that's rare in wartime. Even if there is a tribunal, it's usually goes into it with a foregone conclusion, and it is much more a standard act of another way to kill somebody, but in this instance, it is an armed person killing an unarmed person. And this, but the thing that I was unprepared for when we began our research is how often the armed person consciously decides they want themselves photographed in this act. It is very, very common for that decision to be made. And this is a British airman being executed with an audience by a Japanese soldier. The other picture is actually just a consequence of war. In the Gulf War, we very consciously, there was a long convoy of trucks, of soldiers, Iraqi soldiers, trying to get from A to B, and we bombed the first truck, and we bombed the second truck, the last truck, therefore capturing everybody in between, and then we bombed everything in between, and most of the trucks exploded. So this is an Iraqi driver who was caught. You can see he's trying to get out of the truck by the explosion and the fire. And the photographer who made this picture said he made it because he didn't want his mother and everybody else who went to the movies to think that what they saw in the movies was actually what happened in war. It was a photograph the United States wouldn't publish, and it was published widely in Europe, throughout the world, but not in the United States till much later. So the people that I am dealing with are instances of photographers who have believed that there is something happening out there in the world that they need to document and we need to see. They have done it at the risk of their own lives. Often there are hundreds of news journalists and photographers who have lost their lives in armed conflict. But they believed it was something we had to see, and we believed in doing this exhibition that it was something that needed to be discussed. And we felt that the discussions had become narrow and limited and academic in a kind of judgmental way that was uninteresting. So we decided to put this exhibition together. One thing we wanted to do is most of the discussions about war photography were basically about journalism and not, didn't include the millions of photographs that are made for very many different purposes regarding war. One of the big categories often excluded from such discussions are military photographers. And there are really important and major photographs that have been made by military photographers, often who are unknown. This is a photograph taken through a periscope where the US submarine has sunk a Japanese battleship. And it is often published as the first photograph taken through a periscope, but the military historians working with us said, Anne, you can't say that because you don't know about the military photographs that have never been released. The other photograph is very much appropriate to your talk because it is one of those instances of which I have begun to find more and more where governments who were involved in genocide systematically photographed what they were doing. This is one photograph out of 3 elaborate albums that were made of the emptying of the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is a boy who is about to be taken to Auschwitz. But the Nazi commander in charge had every stage photographed, the executions and et cetera, and then made into these really beautiful leather-bound volumes, one for Goebbels, one for himself, and one for the commandant of the Polish Nazi movement. Now, in each of these cases, and 3 main ones that I can think of were the Nazis systematically photographed their acts of atrocities. The Khmer Rouge photographed, systematically photographed somebody before they took them to the killing field, and the Argentine government photographed what is known as the disappeared, which are the 30,000 documented 30,000 people who were systematically killed by the Argentine military government in the late 70s and early 80s. And that need to document is something that is so fascinating to me in its efficiency, the efficiency with which they went about, where governments, killing their own citizens, went about recording it. And in all three cases, those photographs were later used. Hitler wanted this because he thought killing the Jews was going to come down as his greatest contribution. I don't know why the Khmer Rouge and the Argentines did, but in all three cases, the photographs were later used in the trials of all these people. That photograph is a news photograph used at the Nuremberg trials. Portraits are actually the largest kind of photograph made in wartime. Everybody who goes to war, quite naturally, wants their picture made to preserve them, and then, of course, journalists make them. They're also made afterwards relative to war. So you have Gay Bloch's photograph of this woman who was a rescuer of Jews during, this is a project where Gay and her partner photographed surviving rescuers of the Holocaust. And one of my favorite reviews of our exhibition referred to this woman as blowing smoke at the Nazis. And then this is a photograph by a journalist of a man who had just come out of combat. What it looked like to be, to have just returned from a combat situation. Then you have the journalists, and you have two different kinds. You have newspaper and magazine. I won't take time today to go into what that means, but basically a newspaper person has to get their images into the newspaper every day, no later than 4 o'clock, the newspaper's time. And the magazine, because the magazines are published weekly or monthly, they have more time to develop their ideas, maybe develop a photo essay. Ziv Cohen is an Israeli photographer and made this chilling photograph through a rifle periscope of someone just walking. And then, of course, now we have the internet, and the internet has changed many things. Among other things, most people I know believe there will be no existing newspaper in 20 years. But the internet has changed the photographer's relationship, among other things. The internet has changed the photographer's relationship to the people they're photographing, because they go out on a patrol in the morning, they come back at noon, they uplink their photographs. Because of Google search, families and the soldiers have their names or their unit, and Google pops up the photographs that the photographers made that morning. The combatants may or may not like them, and then they have to go out on afternoon patrol with them. One of the funniest stories we heard while we were doing the research is the photographer said this soldier starts walking toward him and said, "So, you took my picture this morning?" And the photographer thinks, "Oh, you know." And he said, "So my mother saw it. So she emails me, 'You're smoking?'" He says, "Ma, there are landmines, there are RPGs, there are other ways. The long-term health effects of smoking are really not on my list right now." Mothers are mothers, right? But the internet is also changing our own relationship to world events. Then there are amateur photographs, and we have included soldier snapshot albums in the exhibition, and one of the more chilling ones relative to what you were talking about is this beautiful album in which someone who's quite skilled draftsman drew around each snapshot. And so the one we have on display is a man, a civilian, who's been hung, and the soldier had drawn this beautiful rendering of a noose around the snapshot. But you turn the page and they're drinking in a bar. It's the same, it's he and his friends in a bar. It's their life. Now this picture I want to point out to you, this is a photograph of a young girl, this woman, when Poland was taken by Germany. They made all German heritage people come back to Germany, and they put them in re-education camps, and they separated the children. And so this snapshot comes from this young girl who is in this re-education camp. This is Easter. You can see the Easter bunnies, but instead of Christ's picture, Hitler's picture is here, and the Easter eggs are organized in a swastika. The other picture, which I'll actually talk about in this afternoon's talk, but I just want to mention it here, is the moment, is a photograph having to do with the disappeared in Argentina. Now, what happened was Will and I began to go to archives all over the world, the military archives in Australia and London and Canada and Spain and France, and museums and artist archives and agencies, and we would look all day. And at night, we would talk about, having looked at 100, 200, 300 photographs in a day, which ones stayed in our mind. And we began to make lists of those. And then we came back to the museum, and as we came back, we began to look at those photographs that we were gathering that we thought were powerful images. And they began to fall in patterns. And then when we began to meet with military historians, the military historians said, "Anne, your patterns are the same ones we discuss in conducting armed conflict." Two patterns that are prevalent. This is the most famous photograph of a flag raising. It is Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. And the other photograph that we saw, dozens and dozens of photographs from wartime, is a woman grieving in a cemetery, much like the vulturements of the women of Kerch grieving. Those of you may think, I'll just say, this is not faked. There's a misconception about that, but I don't have time to sort of go into that story. But if you think it's faked and you want to talk to me about it, I can give you the whole story. So the last thing we did was to take these photographs of actual events and organize them in the order of war, so that when you went through the exhibition, you start with the advent of war and you go through the stages of war as perceived by photographers and as experienced by the combatants and civilians. And one of the things that's difficult about this situation and having to sort of race through this idea is, in the show you were immersed in it. And the show at the Annenberg is 180 photographs. In Houston, we had 480 because we really wanted an immersion. These are actual events, and we wanted people to understand. And something I'll talk about more later this afternoon because it's more appropriate is the ways, one of the things that thrills us is the ways in which soldiers are using the photographs in our exhibition for their recovery from conflict. But anyway, photographs of the beginning of war are actually quite rare. You know, you don't usually call up the photographer and say, "We're going to start a war tomorrow, can you be present at such a place?" But this is taken by a Japanese airman. These are the torpedoes going into Battleship Row. We know exactly when this picture is made because Hickam Field has been bombed and the Arizona hasn't exploded. It's 4-5 minutes into the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In both of these instances, 4,000 people are about to die. It just so happens that's the same number, both Pearl Harbor and the 9/11. The other photograph was taken by a photographer who was in Brooklyn, and he saw the first plane go into the first tower on television, and he ran up on his roof, and he actually has a series of the second plane going in. And the thing about these photographs, and the thing about photography, unlike the film, photographs are inert. They don't change. They are what they are. What changes, we see with our brains. We don't just see with our eyes, we see with our brains. Each one of us brings to every photograph our own experiences, our own agendas, our own desires. So this photograph was originally taken as Japanese propaganda, and we found this photograph with both Japanese and German text on the back, which meant that it was traded between the two countries, and it was taken as a source of Japanese pride. We also saw it in a flyer so that Japanese people could buy this photograph for their very own through a bookstore. As a sign of the power of the Japanese military over American military. Now, after the war, when we first saw this picture, of course, it's a very different picture. We, as United States citizens, see this picture and read it as tragedy, because there are men and women who are, it's a Sunday morning, they're getting up to go to church, they're writing a letter, they're changing shifts, whatever they're doing, they don't know that in seconds they are about to die. Then we take people through the idea of embarkation and training. The thing about this photograph of these Australian men going off to World War I, they're not all joyful. You can see the concern in many of their faces about what they are embarking on. This other photograph is a photograph taken at a Marine base of Marine training, but I think that the photographer has looked at a lot of movies, because it's a picture that could easily be a classic military Tom Cruise moment of training. Then through patrol and reconnaissance. Now, the thing relevant to this symposium about these pictures is this is institutional. This is huge mechanisms that exist to support that moment of fighting. These are, this is a battleship, the USS Lexington. Huge manufacturing went around making this battleship exist, feeding all the men on this battleship, fueling the planes, everything that was necessary. This man is using new night vision cameras to look at roadsides outside the military base for where they might be planting landmines. Then we get into the fight itself. We had a whole section of men who are waiting to go into battle, each dealing individually with that confrontation of, will I have the courage? Can I measure up? Will I make this moment to the fight itself? Robert Capa's photographs from D-Day. Then, and there are actually very few photographs of the fight. I ended up taking out, oh, there it is. Okay, I skipped one. The thing about these two photographs, it's dangerous for a photographer to be this close, and that's when photographers are killed. If you're throwing a grenade, you're only 20 to 30 yards away from the enemy. So if a photographer is at this range, that photographer is at risk. What can happen and has killed photographers is, in fact, the enemy has thrown a grenade that then landed in that photographer's location. The famous photographer James Knockway was injured when a grenade was thrown into his Humvee. And the other one is Stalingrad, which was one of the two worst battles of hand-to-hand combat for the Russians during World War II. It was block by block, street by street. And if the photographer is running behind these men, there are bullets flying everywhere. On the Robert Capa picture, a similar landing was Iwo Jima, and the photographer said, both Capa and Joe Rosenthal went in on the first wave with the soldiers or Marines, and what Rosenthal said is landing on the beach in Iwo Jima and not getting hit is like walking in the rain and not getting wet. So these are people who are committed to bringing to us the full story of war. The issue of rescue. This is a soldier seeking to rescue this baby who later died, and a helicopter landing to take away the wounded after an attack on a patrol. And the pink smoke that's how they let the helicopter know where to land. Now, shell shock, I'm so sorry these are all getting cut off. when you talk about the German soldiers who that they engineered the gas chambers because of the toll on the soldiers, we didn't understand. In World War I, it was called the 1,000-yard stare, and you can really see it in this man. Then in World War II, we called it shell shock. Now it's called PTSD, and actually we've dropped the D. But it is the effects of, it can be just a momentary thing that the person can no longer function, and it can be a lifetime. One of the more moving moments for me in the film on World War II, I'm blanking on his name, who makes all the documentaries, is when a man talked about, he was a bomber, and he said he still had dreams, and when he came down in the morning and his right hand was shaking from his dreams of the night, his wife, without saying anything, placed his coffee cup in his left hand. And they didn't talk about it. His dreams of the war and his bombing raids over Europe were just part of their lives, and this was, again, 40 years later, 50 years later after the war. So photographers are trying, this photographer on the left, Nina Berman, is trying to, how do you photograph something that's internal? And that's what she's trying to do. Battlefield death is actually one of the earliest things that photographers could photograph, because in the 19th century, you couldn't photograph, cameras weren't capable of photographing conflict until the Boer War. The Boer War was the first war with the snapshot camera, the film camera, and the submachine gun. Actually, World War I was the first mechanized and industrial war. But the photographing battlefield dead was the way that photographers have communicated to us the loss of the personnel. Now, they sometimes do it in this way, which is to show you the magnitude of the loss, or they sometimes do it by just letting one represent the many. So this, one of the tactics of war, one of the things most of us don't understand is the shooting of prisoners. The military historians have explained to me that the shooting of prisoners is sometimes your only choice. You don't have a front line, you don't have a place to take them to. Pancho Villa lined up everybody over the rank of sergeant over a trench and shot them, and this is a man who was alive enough to partially climb out before he died. Burial and grief, prisoners of war. We wanted to also show that there is moments of relaxation for the combatants. There's a funny story to this picture which is relevant in our discussion of violence, because we knew about this picture. It's North Vietnamese soldiers. We tried to have North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, Germans, Americans. We tried to represent the story we were telling through both sides. We didn't know how we were going to find these North Vietnamese photographers, and we emailed people all over the world. Finally, this email comes back to us. Dear Ms. Tucker, we are so pleased that you want to put my father's photograph in your exhibition. I live in Houston, and I am a member of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. So the daughter of this very respected colonel in the North Vietnamese Army now lives in Houston and has a business. So this turnover of enemy to non-enemy. Medicine was something we conveyed. Faith is an important part of war. Constantine was the first to initiate military chaplains. We represented both Christian and Muslim in the exhibition. Those handprints are to protect his generator. And Gene Smith made an ironic photograph with the cross for the Sunday morning service on the battleship set up next to the kill marks of that battleship. Refugees, and I have very little time, 13 seconds. I just want to show you that we had a big section on civilians, because collateral damage is something we were very concerned about, and the effect of war on civilians and particularly on children. And there are huge amount of research being done. And then you have victory and defeat and the two sides of the end of war. So thank you very much.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.